Thank you and good morning to all of you. And it's good that we're starting the 4 or 5 day conference with this very important meeting on a transition to clean energy. And I'm glad that it's being connected with good and decent jobs, because we clearly see that the transition to a low carbon economy to make our communities healthy, safer, and more resilient is directly connected to the well-being of our people. Whether it is the creation of more jobs or the health of our people and our communities, of our women and children and the elderly, or even the availability of livelihoods. All environmental laws you can think of are already present in the Philippines. And I'm proud to say that in my 3 terms in the Senate for almost 20 years, I have authored these laws. Let me state them. The Clean Air Act of 1999, the Clean Water Act of 2003, the Ecological Solid Waste Management Law, where you segregate garbage at source, recycle, and compost, of 2001, the Renewable Energy Law of 2008, the Climate Change Act, which created the Commission on Climate Change, of 2009, its a mandatory law, the People's Survival Fund of 2011, the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Law of 2011, the Environmental Education Awareness Act. So you see, I can go on and on. All the policies are in place. The challenge for the Philippines is for our agencies and bureaus and departments to be able to effectively and implement all these important laws. Now, recently we passed the Green Jobs Act. That's very important because it incentivizes those in green and sustainable energy endeavors. Now, whether it is in renewable energy, in the construction of wind farms, solar power plants, or even in biomass or hydropower, this generates jobs compared to coal-fired power plants or diesel plants, which are not just destructive to the environment, but also has adverse impacts on the community and on health. Now, even in other areas which may not be directly connected to energy, but provide a haven for a clean environment, like segregation of waste at source, recycling, and composting. You may say, this is not connected to clean energy. But if we actually segregate waste, and we follow RA 9003, you're able to provide green jobs as well, so that you don't live beside a mound of garbage or an open dump, which is outlawed by now. My office, together with the Ombudsman, has been proactive in the implementation of Republic Act 9003, where no less than 50 local governments have already been sued, but filed cases by the Environmental Ombudsman for the lack of compliance to RA 9003. But of course, that's a different story altogether. Let's go back to the Asia Clean Energy Forum. The laws are in place, and I hope that we could see a more proactive stand of our government itself to seize the opportunity of helping promote clean energy in our transition to such. But then again, it is important that it should be private sector led. Being a legislator of 3 terms and being the chairman of the Finance Committee, where I provide the funding and assistance to the whole government, it is important that we see the private sector following the laws that we have set in place in government and to provide the initiatives there, and livelihoods and decent jobs will follow. And I can see that there is not a lack of it. In the private sector alone, solar is what I'm more familiar with. There's more than 800 megawatts of solar energy in the Philippines, in fact, way beyond the 500 megawatts subscription under the feed-in tariff in March of last year, meaning that there were more investments than there were accommodated under the Philippines feed-in tariff program. But even without the feed-in tariff, which is 8.69 as of last year, investments must be made because we see that there is already, almost at least, grid parity between renewables and fossil fuel. So my take on this is, why should the Philippine government, or even the private sector, fund or encourage or even accept investments in fossil fuel, be it bunker, diesel, coal, or whichever, on long-term contracts, 5, 10, 20, 25 years, of a resource that is dirty, that is imported, and therefore dependent on fluctuations of foreign currency, especially now as we speak, when Gulf states are closing their borders to each other because of allegations of support to terrorism. You'll say, what has it got to do with clean energy? Because if we use imported fuel, and we are dependent on imported fuel from the Gulf states, that would affect the foreign currency difference for the Philippine peso. The wind is free, why not use it? The sun is there, why not harness it? We're an archipelago of more than 822 coastal municipalities, of at least 64 coastal provinces in 81 of total 81 provinces. And so we must harness the sun, the wind, biomass, hydro, and this will generate jobs in the grassroots, in the local communities, of course respecting the rights of indigenous people and protecting the rights and safety of our workers. So back to your question, what have I done as a legislator to promote clean and green energy and a clean and sustainable environment and clean, decent jobs? Well, I think in the past almost 20 years, actually 98, so that's 19 years being a senator in my 3 terms, the enactment of the 8 environmental laws that I mentioned, and also one of the most important things, since I chaired the Committee on Finance, it's my second year chairing the finance, never will you see in the history of our country, and I'm proud to say that, such a green budget, where general provisions and special provisions in our General Appropriations Act are geared towards clean, resilient communities. What do I mean? Even the stock taking and the inventory and database of biodiversity in state universities and colleges is mandated by my law on the budget. And I micromanage everything, even the construction, let's say, of farm-to-market roads must be attuned to resilience. It's not, first we are carbon tagging, climate tagging, all expenditures through the Department of Budget and Management, but that's not enough. And I would like to also see the standards of their climate tagging, because they may say it's a flood control infrastructure, but it may not be done well, so it may not be a right climate tag expenditure. So apart from climate tagging, our expenditures, general and special provisions are indicated in our General Appropriations Act. For example, the planting of mangroves in all coastal barangays all over the country. I don't have to preach to the choir. All of you here are environmentalists, I suppose, and know the basic information about mangroves. Number 1, not to cut, but second, to plant more, because they're the most natural buffer against storm surge. Yolanda hit, and people did not quite understand what storm surge meant. Mangrove areas in other barangays were not as hardly hit because they were full of mangroves. So if you plant mangroves, and it's indicated in my General Appropriations Act, which is the most important piece of legislation for Congress. Another is the planting of coconut palms in the triangular method, which makes it a natural buffer against strong winds. We don't have to build too much on cement, and we can actually use these elements which we are blessed with in our country to have natural buffers against strong winds and against storm surge. Now, back to the transition to a low-carbon economy. I've also mandated the stock taking of government public infrastructure on the utilization of energy. I also have a pending measure on the energy efficiency bill so that we don't overuse or uselessly utilize lights, the mere taking off of our switches and plugs before we leave our homes and offices could save us so much in terms of energy conservation. If you just do an audit of all our buildings, even the ADB, first I assume this should be LED. Number two, LED. Number two, when you think about the design, do you actually need all these dozens of lights? Will we be able to see without these lights? Even in the construction of homes and buildings, is it not better to have windows so we use the natural sun rays instead of having lights? In terms of our air conditioner, good, it's warm. That means, do we actually put it in a room temperature 25 degrees so that there's thermostat so you don't use it too much? I always try them in the Senate because we freeze in the Senate with below 20 degrees, and when you actually can put it to 25 degrees. So does the ADB actually have a rainwater collector so that and the water that goes on its roof is actually being used in the rainwater collector so that to clean cars owned by ADB or have a little garden there, which you have, is rainwater being used, or do we actually use Maynila or Manila water, which is chlorinated, which doesn't make sense because the plants would rather have rainwater? So these are simple, very basic, everyday to-do things. But then again, back to your question. The transition to clean energy should be private sector driven. We've already laid the policies in place. What we need to do in government is to facilitate a simpler, faster, more efficient processing of permits, of land conversion, if it's on land, of clarity in terms of requirements for investments, and for the facilitation of all of these until its completion. I know I'm speaking too long. On a last note, it is a challenge for the Philippines to provide clean power to our sitios, to our small islands, to people who don't have access to electricity. And I hope that the way forward is not by providing them diesel gensets. It is unconscionable to be charging our poor people and local municipalities in rural areas 15 pesos per kilowatt hour when there is half the price of solar with battery. Because cooperatives, some, not all, and distribution utilities would prefer dirty, expensive fuel. And I ask the question, why? That's a question that's an answer. I have the answer. I cannot say it in this form. Why do DUs prefer dirty, expensive fuel, bunker or diesel, that they are used to, and would enter into long contracts, disadvantages to the poor people, rather than something cleaner, more resilient, and less expensive? I leave you with that question. Thank you.